My name is Natalie Brooks, and I've spent the last 10 years helping companies climb out of financial chaos and find their rhythm again. Numbers are my language. Patterns, risk models, projections, I see them clearer than most people see road signs. So when I joined Arkell Solutions as their financial strategy lead, I thought I'd finally found a place where I could make a real difference. That belief shattered halfway through my third month in a meeting that pushed me to a decision I never imagined I'd have to make. I remember gripping the edge of the conference table, trying to keep my voice steady. I was in the middle of explaining how reallocating operational funds toward client retention initiatives could stretch our runway another quarter. I had spent 3 weeks crafting that analysis, spreadsheets, forecasts, risk models. But before I could finish the sentence, Ryan Cooper leaned forward, smiling like he was doing me a favor. "What Natalie is trying to say is that maybe we're overspending on outreach," he said, hijacking the moment. He turned to the CEO, Logan, as if I wasn't even there. And just like that, the room moved on. A few nods. Someone jotted something down. The conversation swerved away from everything I had prepared. I marked the tally discreetly under my notes. That was interruption number 17, in 90 minutes. I glanced around the room. Logan Pierce didn't even notice. Or worse, he noticed and didn't care. Zachary, our CTO, tapped away on his laptop. Derek Lee, the product director, looked like he was somewhere else entirely. No one said a word about it, not once. I'd been dismissed again, in plain sight. I wasn't shouting or stumbling. I was presenting a carefully constructed strategy, and yet it was treated like background noise. The silence after the interruption felt heavier than the words themselves. It wasn't just disrespect, it was erasure. I kept my expression neutral. I'd learned that anything more would be labeled emotional or difficult. But inside, something cracked. Not in a loud, dramatic way. It was quieter than that, more final, like the sound of a door closing behind you. That day didn't start differently from any other. I had rehearsed my points, kept them concise, and even shared the deck in advance. I'd done everything right. I followed every unwritten rule of how a woman should speak in a boardroom to be taken seriously. And still, 17 times. Not once had Ryan or Zachary been interrupted when they spoke. Not even once. I counted. There's a specific kind of exhaustion that comes from being ignored over and over, not because your ideas are weak, but because your voice isn't the one they're used to hearing. That meeting made something clear. I wasn't being oversensitive. I wasn't misreading the room. I was being silenced. And if I didn't find a way to be heard, nothing would ever change. That was the moment I realized I needed proof. Not just for them, for me. Because if they weren't going to listen to my voice, then maybe they'd have to listen to what I recorded. After that meeting, I couldn't stop thinking about how often it had happened. Not just that day. Not just Ryan. I started replaying past meetings in my mind, scrolling through memories like they were security footage. The same pattern kept surfacing. I'd present something strategic, foundational, and often backed by weeks of work. Then the interruptions would come, mostly from Ryan, occasionally from Zachary, and sometimes without any irony from Logan himself. Always the same rhythm. They would cut in mid-thought, redirect the conversation, and take the room with them. And my work would be left unfinished, unaddressed, and almost always uncredited. At first, I questioned my delivery. Was I speaking too fast? Too slow? Did I sound uncertain without realizing it? I adjusted. I practiced in front of a mirror, then recorded myself. I trimmed unnecessary language. I used bullet points. I even tried lowering my voice a half tone to sound more authoritative. None of it made a difference. The interruptions kept coming. Then I wondered if it was the content. Maybe I was being too technical or too ambitious. So I scaled it back. I added context. I simplified the charts. I focused on bite-sized takeaways. Still nothing changed. My voice would barely gain momentum before it was redirected or shut down. Meanwhile, I watched Zachary present overly complex infrastructure maps without interruption. I watched Ryan pitch marketing initiatives that barely moved the needle and still get full attention and follow-up questions. Logan always nodded at them, always gave them space. What began as frustration turned into something else. I needed data. I created a private spreadsheet. At first, it was just a few lines. Date, topic, number of interruptions, who did it. Then I started noting who else was in the room and how long each person spoke. Over the next 6 weeks, I tracked every single meeting I attended. The results were impossible to ignore. In meetings where Ryan spoke, he was interrupted an average of 0.6 times per session, Zachary less than once. Derek Lee hovered around 1-2. For me, the number sat stubbornly between 9 and 14 depending on the size of the meeting. It didn't matter how early I spoke or how senior the audience was. The pattern held. I even noted which of my ideas were later brought back up, usually by Ryan or Zachary, weeks later, rephrased slightly, and suddenly taken seriously. I wanted to believe it was unintentional. Maybe these guys were just excited. That maybe Logan was too distracted managing the bigger picture to notice. But data doesn't lie. Patterns don't form by accident. And the impact wasn't just professional. It started creeping into how I saw myself. I second-guessed my instincts. I hesitated before speaking. I spent more time thinking about how to avoid being interrupted than about refining my analysis. It was corrosive. Once after a particularly bad meeting, I approached Ryan directly. I told him I noticed he often cut in during my presentations and that I'd appreciate being able to finish a thought before discussion started. He smiled, said he hadn't noticed, and reminded me that meetings tend to run long. He wasn't wrong, but I'd just watched him speak uninterrupted for 15 minutes about a campaign that had already failed. Timing, it seemed, was a matter of perspective. After that, I stopped confronting. I started observing. Logan's silence wasn't neutrality. It was complicity. By doing nothing, he validated the interruptions. Every nod, every pivot, every refusal to refocus the room on what I'd prepared became part of the system that erased my voice. But I didn't stop showing up. I didn't stop presenting. I documented more carefully. I refined my notes. I added timestamps. I kept a private folder of versioned files recording when I shared a slide deck and who opened it. And still, I was asked in follow-ups why I hadn't raised a particular point, one that had been right there on slide 12, buried under someone else's voice. There was one moment that pushed me further than I'd gone before. I was presenting quarterly projections, real numbers, hard-won insights that showed how we could reduce burn and hit profitability 6 months earlier than planned. Logan introduced me, nodded, and within 3 minutes, Ryan cut in. Then Zachary. Then Derek. Each time it pulled energy from the room. By the end, I hadn't finished even half the plan. I walked back to my desk, sat in silence. Then I opened my interruption tracker and entered 17. I stared at the number, then scrolled up. The trend line looked like a slow climb up a mountain that never leveled off. That's when it hit me. I had enough data to show something real. A pattern. Not a feeling, not a guess. Proof. I didn't know exactly what I'd do with it yet, but I knew this much. If they weren't going to listen to me, they might have to listen to something else. The night after that meeting, I sat on my living room floor with my laptop open and my thoughts running in loops. I wasn't angry in the usual way. It was something colder, a quiet calculation building in the background, like the low hum before a storm. I stared at my interruption tracker, rereading each entry. It wasn't enough to know the truth anymore. I needed them to see it, hear it. The idea to record started as a whisper. I pushed it away at first. It felt drastic, like crossing a line, but then I thought about how many lines had already been cross lines they never even acknowledged. I typed a question into my search bar. Is it legal to record a meeting in New York without notifying others? The answer came back fast. Single-party consent. Legal? My breath caught. I reread it 3 times to be sure. I didn't plan to publish it. This wasn't about shame or spectacle. I just needed something no one could deny. Proof, not perception. Facts, not feelings. I read through workplace privacy laws, then articles on ethics, whistleblower cases, anything that made me feel like I wasn't being paranoid. I wasn't. I was preparing. That entire week I practiced staying calm. I kept my tone, even my voice, steady. I made sure my phone was fully charged each morning and my recording app was easy to access with one swipe. I tested it twice in my apartment to check the sound. It picked up voices clearly, even from across the room. It was enough. The day of the investor meeting, I arrived early. The conference room was quiet sunlight spilling across the long table. I chose my seat carefully, not too close to Logan, not in the far corner either. I placed my phone face down near my notebook screen, dimmed the app already open. When I pressed record, my fingers hesitated for half a second. Then I tapped the screen and slid my hand away like it was nothing, like it was any other morning. My heart thudded so loudly I was sure someone could hear it. I reached for my coffee just to give my hands something to do. Every second after that felt sharper. Every chair shuffle, every murmur, every glance. I couldn't tell if I looked composed or completely transparent, but no one noticed. Or if they did, they didn't care. As people trickled in, the usual buzz filled the room. Ryan joked about traffic. Zachary muttered something about Wi-Fi. Logan kept checking his watch. Then the screen at the end of the room lit up, and Richard Hale's face appeared. I swallowed hard. This was it. This was the meeting that would decide everything, not just for the company, but for me. The moment my name was introduced, I felt my spine lock straight. I opened my laptop, steadied my breath, and began to speak. I could hear myself through the recording in my mind, like I was listening from outside my body. It was surreal, and yet nothing about it felt accidental. Every word I said was measured. Every pause is intentional. And every interruption that followed felt heavier, more obvious, more absurd. For once, I wasn't just experiencing it. I was documenting it in real time, and they didn't even know. A part of me kept waiting for someone to notice, for someone to say something about the phone on the table. But no one did, and with every passing minute, my conviction grew. Not in the act itself, but in why I was doing it. I didn't want revenge. I wanted recognition. And for once, I wasn't going to leave that up to chance. I had barely made it through my third slide when Ryan leaned forward, cutting in with his usual polished concern. He said the numbers looked ambitious, that maybe we should focus on something more grounded. I smiled slightly, kept my voice steady, and continued presenting. But less than 2 minutes later, Zachary jumped in, pointing out infrastructure costs like they were somehow invisible to my projections. I nodded again, adjusted, and moved on. And just as I was stepping into the core of our model, the part that mattered most, Derek tried to add something about user growth that supposedly impacted everything I had just explained. I could feel it starting to unravel. That slow tightening in my chest, that internal question of whether I'd make it to the final point before someone else grabbed the narrative again. I looked across the table and caught Logan watching without expression. His hands clasped loosely like none of this registered as a problem. I was used to this. I had recorded it happening, but that didn't make it any easier. And then it happened. A sound, subtle at first. Richard cleared his throat. The room stopped. You could hear the tension clench like a fist. He leaned slightly forward on the video screen, eyes sharp, calm, not angry, but surgical. He said he had noticed a pattern. That Natalie me had been interrupted 3 times in under 10 minutes. He was counting, and everyone else should have been too. The air felt electric. Ryan looked down. Zachary adjusted his chair. Derek didn't move at all. Even Logan shifted in his seat, visibly uncomfortable for the first time in the entire meeting. Richard didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His authority filled every inch of the conference room from miles away. He reminded them that I had been silent during the last 2 meetings, that it didn't make sense considering I was brought in as the financial strategist behind one of the most successful turnarounds his firm had seen. He paused, just long enough for it to sting. Then he said he wanted to hear my entire strategy without another interruption. Not a single one. And after that, he intended to understand why this pattern existed at Arkle. No one said a word. My heart pounded in my ears. I wasn't sure whether to speak or to cry. I chose the former. I glanced at my phone. Still recording, still alive. Then I looked up, took a breath, and picked up where I had left off. Only this time, I wasn't speaking into a void. They were finally listening. When I finished presenting, the room was completely still. I had delivered every point, every projection, every risk analysis without a single interruption. My voice didn't shake. My numbers held. Richard sat silently for a moment on the screen, arms crossed, absorbing everything I had just laid out. Then he nodded once, deliberate and sure, and spoke again. He said this was the level of strategic thinking he expected when his firm decided to back Arkle. Then, without pausing, he laid out the terms for his continued investment. First, I would be promoted to Chief Strategy Officer, effective immediately. My reporting line would shift, no longer filtered through Logan. I would answer directly to Richard, no exceptions. The room shifted. You could feel the ripple. I didn't look at Logan or Ryan or Zachary. I kept my eyes on Richard's face. His next condition followed swiftly. Every senior leader at Arkle, including Logan, would be required to complete a comprehensive training program focused on communication inclusion and leadership accountability. Assessments would be quarterly. Participation would be mandatory. The funding, $80 million, depended on it. He didn't ask if that would be acceptable. He stated it as fact. As non-negotiable. And in that moment, it was clear to everyone watching that this was no longer a conversation. It was a restructuring. A recalibration of who held power in the room. I was stunned. Grateful, yes, but also grounded. This wasn't luck. It wasn't charity. I had done the work. I had prepared the strategy. I had earned the numbers, held my composure, and documented the dysfunction. This wasn't a reward. It was recognition. And Richard wasn't giving me anything. He was finally clearing space for what I had already brought to the table. He added one last point. I would also be joining his advisory board with a separate compensation package and strategic oversight role across his portfolio companies. The silence that followed was deafening. Logan finally nodded. His face was tight. He agreed to the terms. Ryan looked away. Zachary sat frozen. And I sat there calm but electric inside, knowing everything had just changed. When Richard turned to me and asked if I accepted the offer, I met his gaze through the screen. I told him yes. I believed in the company. I believed in the work. And I was ready to lead. Becoming CSO didn't mean the resistance stopped. It just meant it got quieter. No one challenged the decision outright, but it showed up in more subtle ways. Tight smiles, delayed email responses, missing follow-through on action items that had always been routine. Ryan stopped inviting me to pre-meeting strategy huddles. Zachary questioned every timeline I proposed, pushing back with vague concerns about scalability. Even Logan, though publicly supportive, kept his tone clipped in meetings like he was waiting for me to trip. I didn't argue. I didn't lecture. I asked good questions they had to answer. When Ryan dismissed part of the new marketing reallocation plan as disruptive, I pulled out data showing declining ROI from his campaigns and compared it to projections from the restructured model. When Zachary pushed back on shifting dev resources, I brought up usage metrics that showed less than 7% of our user base relied on the features his team had prioritized. The numbers didn't lie, and I made sure they told the story before I ever had to. But I didn't come in swinging. I listened first. I scheduled one-on-ones with every department head. I asked what was working, what wasn't, and what they felt blocked progress. In those meetings, I said little. I took notes. I acknowledged their concerns even if I didn't agree with them. People expected me to dominate the room. Instead, I created space they hadn't expected, and in that space I started to earn trust. Still, Ryan remained guarded. In a budget planning session, he finally said what he'd been holding back. He told me it felt personal, like I was undoing his work just to make a point. I didn't flinch. I told him it wasn't personal. It was structural. The company was bleeding cash, and marketing was a major artery. I asked him to help shape the transition instead of resisting it. Slowly, the edge in his voice dulled. Zachary was harder. He didn't like change, and he especially didn't like change coming from someone who wasn't a developer. We had 3 separate clashes over infrastructure proposals, and each time he accused me of misunderstanding technical complexity. I didn't argue. I asked for specifics. I challenged him to show me numbers. And when he couldn't, I showed him mine. It wasn't a power play. It was accountability. And over time, even he had to acknowledge the logic. The shift didn't happen in a single moment. It came in small increments. A head nod in a meeting, a shared Slack message of support, a follow-up question instead of a shutdown. I watched it unfold the way you watch spring edge into winter quietly with no ceremony. And it wasn't about being liked. It was about being respected. By the end of the quarter, the early indicators were strong. Customer retention was up, acquisition costs were down, departments were executing faster because priorities were clear. Richard sent me a short note. Just 4 words. Strategy speaks. Numbers prove. There were still undercurrents, still old habits clinging to relevance. But I had something stronger now. Not Richard's backing. My own momentum. I had shown that this wasn't about ego. It was about clarity. And in the end, clarity is what moves companies forward. 1 year later, Arkle looked like a different company. Revenue had climbed by over 60%, operational costs dropped by nearly a third, and customer retention hit a new high. The culture had changed too. Meetings ran with clear agendas, and every voice had a protected window to speak. People didn't just nod anymore. They listened. Not because they were told to, because they had seen what happened when the strategy was heard fully. I walked into the annual investor summit with a quiet sense of closure. My team had delivered results. Richard spoke first, sharing how Arkle had transformed under new leadership. Then he turned to me and asked if I'd share what had made the difference. I didn't mention the interruptions. I didn't mention the recording. I spoke about discipline, about clarity, about listening with intent. And when I sat down, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Settled. After the meeting, Richard pulled me aside. He said he'd been watching how I'd handled Arkle, but also how I'd supported some of the other companies in his portfolio. Then he asked a question I hadn't expected. He wanted me to join his new fund as a partner, not just as an advisor, as someone who would help decide where to invest, how to guide leadership, and how to build companies that actually worked from the inside out. I paused longer than I thought I would. This offer meant stepping away from day-to-day operations at Arkle. It meant starting a new chapter entirely. But when I thought about where I'd been just 12 months earlier, counting interruptions in the margins of my notes, it felt like the right kind of full circle. I said yes. Now, I work with founders every week. I sit in boardrooms and video calls and off-site strategy sessions, and I watch. I listen. I take note of who speaks and who gets spoken over. And when I see a pattern that reminds me of where I once sat, I intervene sooner. I don't need a recording anymore. I recognize the signs. That first notebook where I tracked those interruptions still sits on the shelf in my home office. Not out of bitterness, but as a marker. A reminder of how far I've come and how much further I want to help others go. Power isn't about taking over the room. It's about making space inside it. Real leadership is the quiet kind. The kind that listens. The kind that doesn't need to raise its voice to be heard. And now I get to make sure more voices rise with strategy, not just volume. If you've ever been in a meeting where you couldn't finish a sentence, where someone else took credit for your idea, or where you felt invisible no matter how much you prepared, I just want you to know you're not imagining it. It's real. And it hurts. But you're not powerless. Your voice matters, even if you have to fight to protect it.